an MPA class of 99. So it's our 25th reunion. Woo. I am also a member of the Alumni Board and the director for the Harvard Alumni Association, representing the Kennedy School, representing you at the Harvard Alumni Association. And it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce this morning's panel with three distinguished members of the Kennedy School faculty, Stephen Walt, Juliette, Kayyem, and Allison. And actually, on the personal note, I remember very fondly having been a TA with Professor Allison when he rewrote Essence of Decision, probably one of the books that we have all read, digested, and that shaped our way of thinking. And every week he would come in with a new chapter. And then the students would have to read them, critique them, and then I would have to write up what they thought was good, not so good, and share it back with him. So I'm very proud and of introducing him. Steve Walt will be leading the discussion. He is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Kennedy School. He served also as academic dean. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has various roles at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, Brookings Institutions. He taught at Princeton and Chicago before, and he will be leading the panel discussion. And so I'll hand over to him and wish you all a very interesting and exciting moment of exchange.
All right. Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, and welcome back, everybody. This panel is on international relations and security, and you really couldn't ask for two better people to talk about that issue than Graham and Juliette. If you don't know who Graham is, you are at the wrong reunion. He's the founding dean, the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government, former director of the Belfer Center, has served in the Defense Department in a number of different capacities, and is the author of many important works, including, of course, Essence of Decision, and most recently, Destined for War. He is just back from a trip to China where he met with Xi Jinping, and you may rest assured I'm going to ask him about that as we proceed. He is joined by Juliette Kayyem, who's the Belfer Senior Lecturer here, in addition to a truly exhausting list of other activities that I don't have time to go through. She is, among other things, a national security correspondent for CNN, writes frequently for The Atlantic, appears on WGBH. She was Assistant Secretary in the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama, and before that, Homeland Security Advisor to Governor Deval Patrick here in Massachusetts. Also the author of 6 books, including the most recent one with a great title, The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters. So we're going to talk for 35, 40 minutes or so and then open this up for Q&A. And I want to start with the following question. We have this election coming up in November, and everyone seems to think it's going to be important in a variety of ways, including in foreign policy. So my first question to Juliette and Graham is, do you agree? Graham, is this an important election, especially with respect to foreign policy?
Well, thank you, and it's a great privilege for us to have so many folks back, and it's great fun to see people and get a chance to hear what they've done. I did a forum event here about a month ago with former Republican House Chair Kevin McCarthy, and he surprised us by doing a focus group in which he said, look, I'm going to not ask you who you would prefer to win in November, but I'm asking you who you think would win if the election were held today. And he took a hands up or hands down. I won't press you on that, but most of the people were sort of shocked to find that about 2/3 of the students thought if the election was held today, Trump would win. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're looking at the polls, that's certainly correct. I brought some numbers just from this week from the Siena poll that the Times did. So in Nevada, in the swing states, Trump's ahead by 12 points. In Georgia, 10. In Michigan and Arizona, 7. And neck in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin slightly for Biden. So we should think seriously about that. So I think it's now, you could make the argument yes and no, but I would just let me say, I suspect it'll be very significant, and there'll be some very significant changes. I'll just focus on one. So immigration. So almost 2.5 million people entered the U.S. Unidentified last year, essentially unidentified. So about 200,000 people every month. So 50,000 of those show up at legal entry points, and they ask them, why are they there? They say, we're seeking asylum, and they say, okay, and they let them go into the U.S. And another 100,000 are caught illegally entering the U.S., and for most of those, they ask them, what are you doing here? And they say, we're seeking asylum, and they let them go in the U.S. until they call them up, and they call them up sometime over the next 3 or 4 years, and half don't show up. And then another 50,000 show up, they don't even know who they are. So they come, drones find them. So if this is a Trump administration, I believe that'll stop very rapidly. And then what's going to happen to those 2.5 million people every day? They're going to be backing up in Mexico. So Mexico is going to be in, and then wherever they're coming from, that's just backing down to Central America. So I would say in that domain, both internationally and here at home, where Trump has been very clear, he's going to try to round up the people who are here illegally, who were now tens of millions. So it'll be an exciting time. Yeah.
Okay. Juliette?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, and I'll just pick up on a couple of issues to think about. I think there's the obvious NATO and, of course, Ukraine, where I think that issue, even the question of continuing commitment is at least up for grabs. If you just, all you can do is just listen to what former President Trump is saying, whether he's for real or just trying to get attention, one doesn't know, and whether he's able to do that, who knows. I think a lot of it will depend on what the House and Senate look like as well. But that will be key. Number two is think about intelligence and intelligence sharing amongst our allies. That's one area where I think we've had a pretty consistent community of intelligence sharing, not even just with our allies, but just sort of an understanding that if we were at threat, our allies and others would tell us. It's sort of a duty to warn, and vice versa. We've seen some tensions about that even in the post-Trump Biden era when the classified information case unfolded. And so think about sort of what kind of pressures or challenges there will be to something that sort of worked on its own. Everyone sort of agreed to this. And then I think the third is just what would it be like to have re-elected Donald Trump? It's one thing to elect him, right? What will it be like to have re-elected him? In terms of foreign policy, it's a transactional foreign policy. I don't mean what he gets out of it. It's just it's bilateral and transactional, and so every other country is going to have to adapt to that. Graham mentions Mexico, but it's not. I mean, it's every country will have to adapt to that, to the sort of the theory of bilateral and transactional, which also includes a president, if he were reelected, whose relationship with Russia. He is much less critical of it and doesn't view it as the threat that Biden does.
I want to push back. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe, since this is a topic about what you've written, maybe we should hear your view about this too, because I know you've made a pretty strong case that the similarities will be greater than the differences.
Well, or that the differences aren't going to be as stark as many people believe. So I was going to ask you to comment on this. So if you consider Biden's views on tariffs against China, right? He has followed the Trump playbook. In fact, he's doubled down on the Trump playbook. If you look at the Biden administration's policies towards the Middle East up until the Gaza war broke out, they were virtually identical to those of the Trump administration. pursuing an expansion of the Abraham Accords, not paying much attention to the Palestinian issue. So on the Middle East, I don't think there's going to be much difference if you get a Trump administration in there as well. And on Ukraine, and this is more controversial, I think if Biden is reelected, you're going to see a movement to try and push for some kind of negotiated settlement. They're not going to say that before the election, but afterwards, both a Trump administration and a Biden administration are going to try and shut the war down. Right? They might do it in different ways. If I were Ukrainian, I'd rather have Biden administration in there than Trump, but the differences are not going to be as stark as many people believe. So I think, Graham, you're probably right on the immigration question, but in the broad outlines, and I'll go one step further, even on NATO, where people are very worried that a Trump administration would do something, remember, there were more American troops in Europe at the end of the Trump administration than when he started. The Trump administration began providing offensive weapons to Ukraine before the Biden administration came in. He will talk tough. There'll be a lot of bark. But whether or not he would actually take the United States out of NATO, I think, is an open question.
Yeah.
So maybe not as big a difference as people think.
I think we'll disagree. We're good friends, so we'll disagree. The idea of a second Trump presidency, you're aligning that with the first Trump presidency. So that's assuming that the strategy of the last 4 years of what would then benefit him, that's a successful strategy that made him president again, hasn't changed him. And so that's just my pushback to you, that you know, it's called the revenge presidency. But you know, what does that mean? And then does he then perceive that one of the reasons why he didn't get reelected was because he wasn't even more? I look at the data on the Homeland side. Donald Trump would have been president as a big but for the pandemic. I mean, it's just obvious. I mean, the people liked whatever your politics are. There was almost no metric that changed dramatically until the pandemic.
So I'd push back as well, Steve. I think that in the first instance, the first round of Trump, most of the time he was learning the job. So he had a bunch of people with him, most of whom were mainstream foreign policy establishmentarians, and who basically slow walked him with respect to issues that he wanted to do something about. I think he's now learned a lot, and he's looking for people that'll be of like mind and more loyal and more capable. So I would say that's the first point. Second point, I think in Ukraine peace, I think he's been very clear that he's ready to make peace on day one. I think he will, not on day one, but very early. But he'll simply say, as he said, he would say to Zelensky and Ukraine, this is over, finished. You're getting no more support from the US as of today. And now think about your options. And in fact, I think he might decide he would like to become the peacemaker, and he likes that idea. And I think under those circumstances, he might be able actually to play a pretty impressive role here. So I would suspect, thirdly, if you look at tariffs, take another domain. There he said Lighthouser is going to be his man for tariffs. He's talked about putting tariffs of 10% on everybody's imports and 50% on all the Chinese imports. Now, would he do that? Well, excuse me, he might. And if he did, think about what this does for the international economy and for the US economy. So I think it's going to be a little more exciting ride than the last time.
Yeah. Excitement is not always a good thing.
Yeah, no.
So I'm going to push Graham one more time. So you've just been to China. You met with Xi Jinping. Who do you think he would vote for if he were allowed to vote?
That's a great question.
And what else did you learn from him?
Well, this would be a long lecture, so I'll just try to be brief. I think that there's no question that the Chinese were watching very carefully the election and that they have views about it. But their main line is, we have nothing to do with the election. We don't have a chance to vote in the election. It would be inappropriate for us to have any views or express any views. But I remember in the 2020 election, I had become fairly friendly with somebody in the first circle, one of the people that reports directly to Xi Jinping. And because they became fascinated by my book on Destined for War and Thucydides, since they had never heard of Thucydides before, most of them. And the idea that there was this guy that was a contemporary of Confucius, who had big ideas and patterns in history and so forth, excited them a lot, so they were quite interested in talking about the topic. So on one occasion, after we'd been talking, I said, well, you know, here are the elections coming up. What are the views? And he said, will we be in proper first? I said, oh, come on, what do you think? He said, well, to tell the truth, there's a debate here. There's one group of people who say, this fellow is so erratic and so unpredictable that he drives the boss crazy. Chinese love order, and they like a structured system. They like to have a script for the meeting. From the day, Trump is nothing if not extemporaneous. From day one when Xi Jinping showed up at Mar-a-Lago in the visit, they had it all scripted what was supposed to happen. He grabbed him by the arm and took him for a walk, and they began talking about things that weren't even on the agenda. So he's very unpredictable. So they said, so that would lead us to be Biden, you know, or in this case Hillary, will be more of Obama. So that's more comfortable. That's theory one. Theory two says, we couldn't possibly create as much chaos in the US or undermine the American alliance system as effectively as this fellow's doing. So go for it. Yeah.
So I'm going to get us off the election in 1 second, but Juliette, Graham just mentioned chaos in the United States.
Yes.
How worried are you about chaos after the election?
Okay, so
regardless of the
who
outcome.
wins. Okay, so I write a lot. I'm a contributing writer to The Atlantic, and I have a series on sort of on incitement and violence, just sort of thinking about democracy and what's happening to it and what's happened. After January 6, 2021, I wrote a rather controversial and even more controversial headline that I didn't write, article about basically we had to treat the violent wing, and I want to be very careful here. Trump supporters, 99% of them are not violent, but there's 1% that's being nurtured, right? So you know, we have to treat this as a counterterrorism effort. That's the right framework. You isolate the language, you prosecute, you do whatever, and you make groups like the Proud Boys and others who have been implicated, obviously, in January 6th. You make it harder for them to do what terrorist groups need, right? You make it harder for them to raise money and recruit. It's a way of thinking about it. I'm not going to call someone a terrorist. It's just the framework. I came out of counterterrorism in the Department of Justice, how I started my career. Some of that has been successful. I mean, you don't see, but there's still violence as the natural extension of our democratic differences is now in play. And we just have to be honest about it. We have to call it what it is. It's not a wink and a nod and a dog whistle. It is just essentially a way of people talking. I think and you're seeing it in the numbers of people with public officials who have been attacked, who are targeted, and elsewhere. So what will happen? So two scenarios. One is Trump wins. If that's the case, then those groups will be emboldened. There's just it's not political. It's like that identity, right? In terms of the extremism, there's extremism on the left, but I'm going to just quote the FBI, right-wing extremism, 91% of our counterterrorism cases now. So blame them, right? If you don't like the numbers, there is left-wing terrorism, so that will be nurtured, and it will be nurtured in ways that we can't really say. I think one will be on immigration. I think you'll see groups authorized to sort of protect the border. You'll see it in ways that I think Governor Abbott and his forgiveness, his pardon of a man who killed a Black Lives Matter demonstrator, just that kind of sort of wink and nod of sort of an acceptable violence. That sort of is worrisome, and whether the courts can serve as a check, it remains to be seen, and which courts is obviously obvious. On the second piece, though, and one that I've really focused on is if Trump loses. He won't concede. And you're starting to see, especially in his vice presidential candidates, that sort of, well, I'll accept the results of the election if he wins, right? I mean, what does that, you have to sort of play that, what does that actually mean? What are you authorizing? What do you think will happen? I think Biden has been a little bit slow on this, although you're starting to see him pick up on the violence. I want to be very clear here. I think all people who support democracy can support the notion that violence is an unacceptable extension of our democratic differences, and focusing on that. And that's, so I worry, but I also think that there's countercurrents that are looking good as well. Violence does not poll well, generally. So calling it out is important. Okay.
So I'm going to take us away from the United States, which is only one of 193 or so countries in the world, and I want to ask a bigger question. How's the agenda of international relations and security changing? So what are the issues that we used to worry a lot about that we don't have to worry as much now? And what are the issues that you think are rising on the agenda and are going to require more attention, not just from American leaders, but from leaders around the world? Graham?
Oh, a big one. So one point, Steve, that you and I have both written about, and which I think is crucial if we're doing big picture, is to realize that the role of the U.S. in the world inevitably or the capacity of the U.S. to make a difference in the world is inevitably shrinking as our relative power is shrinking. So keep in mind three numbers: a half, a quarter, and a seventh. So in the end of World War II, U.S. has half of the world's GDP. Into the Cold War, 91, a quarter of the world's GDP. Today, a seventh of the world's GDP. That's not because the U.S. shrank. That's because other people grew up. That's a good thing, okay? But on the other hand, the capacity to impact things, to order things, to command things, to influence things, shrinks proportionally. And so the sense that you can see running in the election as well, related to that somehow we're no longer in command. Excuse me, we're not in command. A lot of stuff just happens. In Turkey or in UAE or in Pakistan, people do not ask permission. They don't fear that if they were to take an action without permission, they'll be punished in a way because the U.S. doesn't have enough time and attention. So I would say that's the first big point. Now then, secondly, there are coming all these other issues. I believe still the fundamental issue is war and peace. And I think we should not take for granted the fact that there's not a great power war. Indeed, my expectation is that there'll be a great power war in the next generation. I think it's an anomaly that there hasn't been. This is the longest peace anybody's ever seen, ever in history. So I would say that's not to be taken for granted. That's a great thing to be thankful for. There's also only 9 nuclear weapon states. I mean, John Kennedy would have said, and did say, by the 70s there's going to be 30. So what happened there? Well, again, a pretty amazing set of successes, largely American architected. So I would say that's a big deal. And I could go on and on in that space. That's just in the security space. Lo and behold, we've discovered climate. Yep. We live in an enclosed biosphere. Everybody's greenhouse gases go into the same pot. On the current trajectories, either the US or China could make it uninhabitable for everybody. So is that a big issue? Yes. Technologies are coming in ways that are stretching everybody's minds. I mean, AI is the bright, shiny object now, but if you look at genomics and synthetic biology and what's possible in that space, and if you look at quantum and what's happening in that space, so one of the things the Belfer Center, under Megan O'Sullivan, our new director, is now doing, is emphasizing, as Ash Carter was trying to do, beginning to do, the ways in which these new technologies are transforming both the problems we face, but also the opportunities for doing something about them. So I think it's, this is a very exciting time for people to have a whole array of opportunities, to work on problems, and for the school to do that.
Yeah, it's the great paradox. The more problems there are, the more busier we can be. Juliette.
I'm going to pick up on what Graham said, and from the lens, I think, also of someone who thinks about sort of defense a lot more in the homeland, not just U.S. homeland security. So So on the climate side, I'm just thinking in terms of the stresses climate has on the migration of people. I think that's going to be just a significant issue, and the fight over resources, over natural resources. If you just look at the data, just to give you a sense, in the we talk about mass migration if it's at some South Pacific island. In this year, 3 million Americans have been displaced by climate events. I mean, so the mass migration is happening internally. And thinking about what the movement of people means in terms of both opportunity but stresses on a system, as well as what climate means for our military readiness in terms of, in particular, you're just seeing lots of stresses in terms of our Navy and whatever else. So one is, I think about it as the climate is putting security stresses on all of our capacities to respond, let alone the as important issue about can we mitigate it. On technology, on someone who thinks about, and I teach in crisis management, is one of the things that a way to think about crisis management is, right, the crash landing's happening. My students who take me, I just assume the boom. It's happening. I'm sort of in that world. Is you really only have two options. One is, are you ready for the crash landing, or can you extend the runway? Those are your only two options, right? There's really not else. And so we talk about readiness, but we also talk about buying time. One of the challenges about technology, and in particular AI, one of the opportunities its capacity to understand what's going on in real time is really great. Those of you from California or Turkey or Japan, 6 seconds for earthquake notification saves a lot of lives. That's good, right? That's hard to do without AI and strong technology, but people make decisions, too many decisions made without time, right? So you're sort of dependent on the technology can be bad. And then I'm going to talk as a mother. I was telling both Steve and Graham, I've got 2 graduations this year. I think the third thing globally, if you look at youth vote, is confidence in institutions. First of all, you're all here, presumably you learned a lot about institutions, right? And that institutions and how to lead them and how to manage them and what they mean and their identity. Most of you probably work in institutions. There's the generational shift, in particular in Western Europe, but also South America. I looked at the polling, the United States, of course. I mean, we're like old fogies, right? It's like, oh, you think government works? This is the pandemic generation. This is the lockdown generation. This is, and so I worry about a generation, my kids included, that don't have confidence in institutions that have a capacity to have a common mission, and that's a global phenomenon.
If I can throw my 2 cents in here. So I teach the introductory international relations class here for people who are concentrating in international and global affairs. And one of my final exam questions this semester was to take some of the things they've just referred to. Say, look, humanity is now dealing with a whole series of revolutionary changes happening more or less at the same time, whether it's a rapidly shifting balance of power, as Graham mentioned, whether it's climate change, whether it's revolutionary technologies happening with remarkable speed and in a lot of different domains. It's also happening in a period where the existing set of global institutions, whether it's the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, increasingly seem not fit for purpose, created in a very different world, declining legitimacy, and with some countries starting to suggest that these institutions need to be fundamentally reformed, maybe jettisoned. All of these things are happening simultaneously. So the question is all the needs being created by these changes going to actually produce greater global cooperation as humanity and different countries realize they have to work together? Or is it likely to lead to greater conflict? That was the question my students had to answer. I'm not going to poll you all on it. I will say that my students were roughly equally divided on whether or not this was good news or bad news as well.
What is the professor's answer?
I'm a realist, and therefore I don't think this is going to be easy to manage. I'm with you.
Yeah.
We're going to see lots of trouble ahead as well. And that leads me to my next question. I would just like to ask you both, what do you think today's Kennedy School graduates, those who are interested especially in the world, need to know that the people in the audience didn't need to know.
Oh. Wow. Wow. What do we need to know? What year in the audience?
That's a good question.
When you,
We should
25.
actually probably poll all of you. You know, what do you wish we had taught you?
Yes.
That happened to you. But I'm more into. You may when we open this up, if people want to make comments on that, that's fine. But just sort of, you know, how should we be thinking about training the next generation for the problems that we've just
I'll
described?
start out while
Good.
Julie's
Former dean,
thinking.
thank God.
Since I was deferring to you, but so I think one thing, and I believe this will increasingly be the case, is a clearer recognition that Americans are only one country that share a globe with a lot of other people. So most Americans are surprised to discover that there are about 8 billion other people who don't really agree with, we say, we think. And so if you take, for example, we say the world is organized to resist Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Well, I would say yes, all the world except for the biggest country in the world, the largest democracy in the world, the largest democracies in Africa, the largest democracies in Latin America, about 6 billion other people don't agree. Well, forget about them, okay? What about, we agree with the people we agree with, okay? So I would say first, appreciation that there are a lot of other people out there, a lot of other countries, a lot of other independent actors, and they don't always see the things the way we do. We can actually learn a lot from trying to hear more what they said. I could give you 3 more, but I would say that's the first one.
I like that last one. It's not just recognizing there are others around, but that they often see problems very differently than we do. We don't necessarily have to agree with their interpretation or how they see it, but we need to at least appreciate that that's their worldview, that's how they see it.
The Indian foreign minister, whom I think is the class act of diplomacy today, has this wonderful line that he loves to give grief. This is Jaishankar, to make the Europeans uncomfortable. He says, Europeans believe that every problem that's their problem is a global problem. So they come to India and they say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is a global problem. The whole international order is at risk and so on. And about any real global problem, they say that's not a European problem. I think Americans, he means even more so. Yeah,
probably true.
I think in one area where there's just been, I think, a shift in how we teach it and thinking about it is this idea of leadership, right? This is a school, but if you look at the classes, it's sort of the big man theory of leadership, the military theory of leadership. I think globally, and I see it with my students, that this idea of leadership as being more about sort of unity of effort, about without the sort of formalistic chain of commands. I think that's the way the world is. That's the way our working conditions are. Most of us are, lots of people aren't going into offices anymore around the globe. And I think also when you look at the public policy problems, they will get solved by the public, but also the private sector, NGOs, faith-based communities, disability communities, this sort of array of lots of different interests that aren't necessarily public sector, and how you manage those and how you lead those that really aren't in your traditional chain of command has been a significant change. I think at least about it in terms of global disaster and crisis management, that's just a big change.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been teaching here for 25 years, and one of the changes I've observed in the pedagogy is there's far more emphasis on team projects, on group work, because I think people have understood that that's what most graduates of the school are going to spend an enormous amount of their time doing, working with other people to try and solve a common problem. And if they don't start developing those particular skills now, they'll find it much harder. It's not just going back home and writing a paper or going back home and answering an exam. And that's, I think, one of the ways the school has been adapting to sort of the professional needs of the field. So I'm going to bring us back full circle, relatively short answers to this question. Back to the election for a second. I'm pretty sure you're both Democrats, although Graham has worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations. What grade should we give the Biden administration for its handling of international affairs? Now remember, this is supposed to be the A-team, very experienced group of people. But Ukraine is not winning. The Middle East is a mess. Russia and China are working hand in glove, and the global South is mad at us. So I'd say B-. Am I being unfair?
So,
I mean, part of it is, what is the Biden amendment? But to your point right before is, we could have had an immigration deal. We didn't. I mean, there's a lot. There's a delay in getting aid to the Ukrainians. Is that significant in how they're doing now? It depends on who you read. But so a lot of it is even, this idea of leadership. What is a president's foreign policy is going to be checked by lots of forces that are not under his control. I will say I would give them a higher grade in activity than I would in narrative. And I think what's happening in Israel is a perfect example. I think you have another panel on this, but what's that narrative, right? And in other words, and I think Biden may not know what his narrative is, but it's confusing. And for those of us who want to help translate it or figure out what's going on, I don't know what that narrative is.
So Graham, you have more appreciation for how difficult these problems are than just about anybody. What grade would you give?
I'd say at least a B+, so I would disfigure it. And I think if I go through it, it has to be relative to the difficulty of the problems and what would be possible, because as we sit at a distance and everything is clear from Cambridge and the 02138, and it's amazing how the air seems easy to see through, and if you just did this and did that, the problems would be solved. I think we too often we do fantasy solutions as opposed to, so imagine that you didn't have Bibi. Well, excuse me, you would have a different problem. Okay, so I would say if I go through the China issue, where again, I think the team has been a good team, and including a lot of people that have had a lot to do with the Kennedy School. So Jake Sullivan or Kurt Campbell, who's been the tip of this spear. They've identified the challenge, I think, properly, and they've been developing a strategy for trying to meet it. I think and one in which they understand that the alliance structure will be the essential multiplier. There's no way that the U.S. is going to counterbalance China by itself. So the building up of the relationships with Japan and South Korea and Australia and India, so there's a strategy there, and I think it's a conceivable, sustainable strategy. On the Russia piece, I think both the Biden team, but I think the previous team would have as well missed the fact that if Russia is not inside the tent pissing out, it's going to be outside of the tent pissing in, to take Lyndon Johnson's famous metaphor. And so trying to find some way to have dealt with the problem rather than ending up where we are seems right. But then once the war started, Biden has been absolutely 100% clear the U.S. is not going to fight World War III for Ukraine. Normal American political impulses and others' impulses would have stumbled into very likely stumbled into something that could have been tragic. So I give them good marks for that, even though, again, it's a very complicated. The Middle East, I think Bibi is so destructive that unless you had some magic way for him to go away, there's not a solution to that problem. And I think that tragedy is that it's going to continue and even going to deepen as long as he's there. I think that fortunately there's a few sane people in his government, including Gallant, the defense minister, and Eisenkot, the former chief of staff. And there's quite a lot of sensibility since in the national security barony, many of whom have relationships with the Kennedy School over the years, about what's going on and about what should be done. But the idea that you have a war in Gaza and we will not tell you what's going to happen after the war. Actually, we won't even tell you exactly what the end of the war looks like. So we have explicitly no plan for the day after. This is called insanity. The idea that we have a war in which we're not prepared to articulate an objective that is coherent. So we have an objective that says we're going to completely destroy Hamas and we're going to recover the hostages. So these two things you cannot do simultaneously. No way. So Amos Yadlin, again, a Kennedy School graduate of whom we're very proud, former head of Israeli military intelligence, has been saying from day one, excuse me, you have two objectives and you have to choose between them. Well, no, we're going to choose. We're just going to say we're going to achieve all of them. And I think Bibi and his right-wing nut, in my view, cabinet members who are determined never to have a Palestinian state, have defined a problem that will be an Israeli security problem forever. So sorry, I gave a speech on the topic, but I feel pretty strongly about it.
Okay, great. So it's now time to open this up for Q&A. You're all alumni of the school, so you know exactly how this works. Please state your name. If you're willing, state the class you're from. And then, as always, keep the question brief and remember to end it with a question mark. And I'll start with the woman over here.
Hi, I'm Hui Dang, and I am the MPP class of 1994. Thank you. I have spent close to 20 years working on one thing, which is we talk a lot about security on this panel, and security that we can see, security that we identify. But you know the biggest security risk actually is cyber. It's things we do not see. It's the financial flows, the things we do. I've been working in the financial crime prevention compliance space for close to 20 years. And I dragged Asia, and I'm talking about the entire region and its government, kicking and screaming into saying, look, you need to look at the risk, look at what you've committed to, and what are the implications of the cyber issue, but also financial flows in funding criminal elements, right? So my question is, when we talk about institutions that currently exist, how are we actually making those institutions, government institutions, private institutions, whatever it is, able to keep up with the underbelly?
Yeah.
There's a huge underbelly that we do not see.
Yeah.
And
Great.
So
This is right in Juliette's wheelhouse.
There's a gazillion ways to answer it, so I'm just going to give you the one of. One of it is, I think, a growing recognition of, and this is reflected in President Biden's recent critical infrastructure memo that I talked a lot about on the Lawfare blog. It basically is let's stop thinking of cyber attacks as cyber attacks. They're physical. They have physical consequences, right? So we've structured an entire world in which, think about your average company or your large global company. They have the chief security officer, the guns, gates, guards guys, as I call them, the 4Gs, and then you have your chief information security officer, and then now after the pandemic, you have your chief health officer, and then on climate, you're going to have your chief resiliency officer. That is a lot of officers, and I think what we need to do is begin to, and what I argue about is we got to stop being threat focused and be consequence focused. Because I can look at the wires all the time, right? But you get a stupid ransomware attack against, say, Colonial Pipeline here in the U.S., and we've shut off energy distribution to half of the U.S. So I think there is beginning to be a recognition that not just the vulnerabilities, in particular, I worry mostly about critical infrastructure, which includes financial, but more, how do you stop the cascading losses, because you have to assume a breach. And so then you're starting to see redundancies and all the things that we do when we think about how do we, as I say, how do we fail safer, right? You're gonna assume the penetration, the cyber attack, and now it is, I'm gonna measure success of, can I keep the financial institutions from falling apart? And you are starting to see some good examples on that as well, right? So just the focus on what the consequences are, because of the need for the network to move fast, makes it inherently vulnerable, and people will try to sell you any company, people will try to convince you that they can keep your networks safe. They can keep them safer, but not safe.
Do you think AI is?
One question per customer. Let me go over here.
Thank you. My name is Allison Shapira. I was a mid-career class of both 2009 and 2010, so I get 2 reunions.
Oh, good.
And I teach the arts of communication here at the Kennedy School.
Oh, good.
And it seems to me that so many of the challenges we face are about how humans communicate with, negotiate with, and work together with other humans for now.
Yeah.
And Professor Walt, you talked about how we give group work assignments at the Kennedy School because we assume that by giving them group work assignments, they will inherently work more effectively in groups, which may or may not be the case. And so I wonder, what new courses do you think we need here at the Kennedy School to specifically address the challenge of how humans work more effectively with other humans? Or maybe have non-human assistance in how to work more effectively with humans?
Oh, wow. That is...
I do not have a good answer to that.
That's a good question.
And I actually think one of the places the school is still groping is not the sort of getting humans to work together. We realize that's a problem. We've worked on that. It's this question of how we're going to be dealing with artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I still don't know how to handle that problem in my classes. How do I make sure, if I really want it to be written by the student and not by ChatGPT or some other variation, how do I verify that? How do I come up with assignments? And how do I actually encourage students to use these tools in a way that actually is going to make them professionally more effective? So authorize it, but then try to find some ways to make sure that I'm not just getting a sophisticated use of AI, that there's actually the knowledge we're trying to impart has penetrated the brain of the student and not just something they were able to write a prompt on. I think it's actually going to be a huge challenge, not just here, but for all educational institutions. Some of my colleagues have gone back to oral exams.
Yep.
Some have gone back to in-class exams, right, et cetera. But I think that's, in some respects, not taking advantage of the opportunity that this technology presents for actually improving student work and ultimately improving professional work. But we're like everybody else. We're grappling with a very rapidly changing environment and probably not as effectively as we should.
Steve, let me add one thing.
Yeah.
The 3 professors here at the school have actually addressed this issue. And in the most exciting teaching venture I've seen, they gave a display of what they've created, which they're going to roll out for everybody this summer. And it'll be an open system. They're building on ChatGPT-4, but they build an open system around that, something that they call ping pong. And they are offering every course, if they want one, a bot that's designed for your course. That'll be part of the exercise where students can go, and after they've heard the lecture or the discussion, can go and ask questions. And then one of the nice things about an AI assistant or bot is you can do that at night whenever you want to. You can do it over, you can repeat. So I would say watch this space. There's something very interesting. I mean, I was shocked. I hadn't any idea what they were doing. This was just a month and a half ago. And I'm going to design for the course I teach in the fall. I mean, they're offering assistance in having a bot that'll be part of your assistant, like you're an additional teaching assistant. So we'll see how it works out. But I was I'm usually skeptical about what people advertise. They did not over-advertise this. They simply said, here's what we're doing. We've done this in our course this spring. We're offering it to people this summer. So I'd say watch that space.
Okay. Sir.
Hi, good morning. Sean Davis, MPP 2004, and thank you. I just want to say quickly on a personal note that all of the panelists have personally or through their work influenced my career immensely, and I'm so grateful to you. And I know that my cohort, my generation of national security practitioners really went to school on you and your work. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
My question is also picking up on AI. So I'm in an industry now where we're spending a lot of time on AI and large language models. And you know, you are three of the most eminent large language models on national security that I know. But you're much better because you have that human touch, which we value.
Yeah.
The question, though, is this: how are presidents and secretaries and combatant commanders here in the US or their equivalents around the world, how are they going to use AI, generative AI, to make decisions? You know, if we think about essence of decision and take the Cuban Missile Crisis to an AI-informed world, how are presidents and other leaders going to deal with that technology?
Because I'm inherently a pessimist, I'll say badly. But I'll tell you, the thing that worries me is that, and I'd love to hear Graham and Juliette on this as well, what worries me is that we're going to gain considerable confidence in the capabilities of this technology, and I worry that we will overstate the confidence. That a commander will get a feed in from his bot or her bot and decide that that has to be correct. Right? We've seen this problem with technology and of other forms, whether it's radar signals or things like that, and that therefore there won't be this sort of that moment of skepticism where you suddenly say, I really need to get some confirmation here before I make a hugely consequential decision on the basis of what I've just been told. Because we already know artificial intelligence will make mistakes too. Right? And no matter how refined the models will get, and they'll get better, I do still worry about, not taking the human out of the equation, but taking human judgment out of the equation. But
I've been trying to understand this for, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, and I've gotten about a millimeter deep. Fortunately, Eric Schmidt, who is a guy that built Google, has been a good tutor, and he and I have written 2 or 3 pieces together about it. I think Steve's absolutely right to emphasize the risks and the downside, and also the risk that actually in the next generation or the generation beyond that for AI, that you'll end up having machines that actually are almost thinking for themselves or choosing things for themselves. They may get tired of us, so there's a whole bunch of dystopian novels in this space to remind us of. But I guess maybe I'm a congenital optimist, but I think the potential use of AI assistants or even co-pilots in an appropriate way will make it possible to better target something, and will make it possible to avoid mistargeting something. So if you just take the examples that we have now, there's plenty of examples where things are used in that way that can be used successfully. Whether the co-pilot can give you a better idea of a strategy for what to do on this front or otherwise, I'm a little suspicious, but it might at least remind you in the same way that a good assistant would, or a good co-pilot would, of some things that you hadn't looked at. So I'm hopeful in this space. Yeah.
I mean, I just, going back to this runway idea, that I was talking about, so I worry that our certainty about AI will make us think our runway shorter, that the human touch, human capacity, just skepticism, right? This doesn't seem right? We always call it, like, for some reason we think having, a gut feeling about something is bad. Well, if you're an expert, I can look at a picture and sort of know whether something was good or bad or whatever. Those of you who've taken, it's like the Waffle House index, right? It's the Waffle House. Those of you from the South know, was a hurricane bad? Well, is the Waffle House open? It doesn't take a genius. If the Waffle House is open, it was, it's just a bad windstorm. So that's the first. The second, but I do want to say, one of the exciting elements in particular in the sort of government, everyone needs to react because something bad has happened, is in the past, our situational awareness was often based on sort of who was the noisiest, right? So just think about communities that get resources fast or whatever. And I do think you're seeing lots of really interesting work in data modeling or whatever. So think about Turkey and Syria earthquake that really can drive resources very, very quickly. And if you think, the 9 meals till anarchy, you basically only have 3 days to get people meals, and then it's essentially over, right? So you have 9 meals, if there's 3 days, this can be life-saving. So I don't really view AI as good or bad. It's a tool. It makes me nervous because I don't know if we know what the tool does, but there are really hopeful elements to it too.
Sir.
Thank you. Krishna Guha, mid-career class of 2004.
Woo!
It's a great crew here today.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring us back to focus on Ukraine for a second. Should we consider the Biden administration's strategy of escalation management as a success because it has prevented the geographic spread of the war, the direct involvement of US military or Russian use of nuclear capabilities, or a failure because even before this latest congressional holdup, it meant that the capabilities provided were always a day late and a dollar short, allowing Russia to rescue what's likely some partial strategic victory from the initial failure of its invasion with potentially serious strategic consequences. Thank you.
I'll let Graham take the first swing, but I'll take one too.
So I had a good fortune to be entangled in this process with some of the people making the choices. And so I'm prejudiced, but I would say that in keeping a clear sense of American priorities, I would give the Biden administration high marks. So they've been very clear that what they care most about is not having a nuclear war with Russia that would have the Kennedy School to go away, okay? I'm in favor of that. Then they would not like to have a wider war in Europe, in which the war would have spread to NATO countries, and there's been a great risk of that, and there's even a risk now as NATO countries or some of the hot heads in them are talking about trying to send some troops to Ukraine to do training. There's been a repeated, particularly as we know about Americans, if anything's not working, we say, well, just do more, just try harder. So the impulses to do more instantly have been constant, and the Biden administration has been watching those very carefully. Now, has the consequence of that been that the delivery of some systems, and as you've escalated up the ladder, come later? Absolutely, correctly, it has. Would the delivery of those earlier have made any decisive difference? That's the claim. I'm dubious. That is, I think that my take on this has been very much consistent with General Milley's take, who was the chairman of the JCS until recently. And in October of 22, so just, again, 6 months into or 8 months into the war, Milley said, this war is now at a stalemate. It's not going to get better than this. And Ukraine should be, and we should be trying to work with Ukraine to get a resolution of this, which would basically be an armistice now, like we had in Korea. And this is not going to get back Ukraine all of the territory that Russia has stolen from it, but it's not going to give up its claim to that. He actually even then gave a speech to the Economic Club in New York, which was ultimately leaked, that outlined this idea. I thought this was the right idea. I continue to think it was.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the fundamental problem, and this goes back to 2014, maybe even earlier than that, is that there is an asymmetry of motivation here. The United States cares what happens in Ukraine. Russia cares more than we do. It is more vital, existential to them. You might disagree with that. You might think that's unfortunate, but I think they care more about the outcome in Ukraine than the United States does. They do not care more than Ukrainians do. That's quite clear as well. But they do care more than we do. And that was something I don't think American leaders took fully into account. Once you started down this road, you were dealing with an adversary that had a much smaller GDP, didn't have quite the same number of sophisticated weapons, but cared more. We are not willing to send American troops to fight for Ukraine. Right? Vladimir Putin has been willing to send thousands of Russians to fight over Ukraine, and of course many of them have died. The second problem, and Graham alluded to this, is it's not just a question of weaponry, it's also the rate at which that weaponry can be absorbed and turned into meaningful military capability. You can't train a pilot to fly an F-16 in a couple of weeks. It's not even clear that having a few F-16s is going to make that critical a difference there. And also from the broader perspective of American interests, there are a finite number of 155 millimeter artillery shells in the world. There's a finite rate at which we can produce them. There's a finite number of Patriot missiles, et cetera. And every one that gets sent to Ukraine is one that has to be taken from somewhere else or has to be eventually manufactured. So I think that the United States was in a tough situation once it became clear that Russia was going to fully mobilize to fight this war. And I'm very much in agreement with Millie's position that there was a moment where we should have pushed much harder to try and shut it down. We would be in a better position had we done so than the one we're in now. Over here.
Thank you. Ibrahim Al-Asil, I'm a graduate MC MPA 2019. My question, you started talking about the potential Trump 2.0 administration, and then we moved to talk about the world. And my question links actually both of them together. You know, for nations as much as for individuals, it's not only about how one sees themselves, it's also about how the world sees them. How do you think this cycle of election and the potential outcome, whether second term for President Biden or another administration for President Trump, would affect the image of the United States in the world? You touched upon China and Russia. What about the rest, the other 190 states around the world? How do you think the image and the soft power, to touch upon also Jonay's theory of soft power in the world, a network of alliances might be affected of the outcome?
Juliette, why don't you go
I'll
first?
start.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a little secret. U.S. immigration policy almost has no impact on migration. So I actually think it won't impact Latin America. I think whatever numbers you're seeing, there might be nastiness on this side, but I think the flows that you see will continue. So the world will just perceive it, do they want to come to America or not? And the numbers were actually higher during the Trump administration than they are under the Biden administration. So one is, you're not going to see the world react in terms of some of these issues. For the Middle East, and in particular, just picking up on what Graham was talking about, it's hard to know about Trump in terms of the world, but I do think the Arab-Palestinian issue will be perceived as not relevant to the United States. I think Biden's trying to walk a fine line there, and I think for someone who cares about this issue personally, it's not my professional background, I think there would be no window for opportunity to think about some resolution, which will have impact on the Arab states as well. And then if you're thinking about Africa, and then I wanted to talk overall, I think the issues that I worry about, and in terms of do people have confidence in us, and therefore not a physical reliance, but just confidence that we are a stable nation, that will end. And the idea that we can export some notion of the rule of law, some notion of human rights, and all of that will be harder to sell. I'm not saying we're throwing it up. I'm not saying our democracy's over. It's just a narrative that we were really, really good at. We were hypocrites, I know that, but we sold something that people were often willing to buy, or at least look at, and we remain this. That's going to be, I think, harder. But I'll end with sort of, I don't know what happens here if Trump wins a second term. I mean, I'm not being whatever. It will be. Will there be pockets of madness or whatever? We just don't know how it unfolds. Part of that is going to be in reaction to him. And I do think none of this matters for what was going to be the result in 2024. I think if you just look at the data, this is honestly, this is a Dobbs election. I mean, if you look at what's the difference between Trump and Biden, people aren't voting on Ukraine. Israel is ranking 11% of interest. I mean, it's a lead in the cable news, but people are voting their economics, and they are really, really voting on something that changed dramatically because of the Trump administration, which is U.S. Reproductive freedoms.
So if I make
Yeah,
one point, I think most countries, at least, I probably talk to foreign leaders, some foreign, folks every day. Most are barely coming into the reality zone to take seriously the fact that Trump might be reelected. If you want to, and most foreign governments are now beginning to, this is at least, making its way down their mental thing. So if you want to, just before Davos this year in January, I wrote a piece called, it's in Foreign Affairs, called The Trump Put, in which the smarter countries are already adjusting their behavior in their relations with the U.S. Against the option that it'll be a Trump rather than the U.S. So for the Europeans, this is totally terrifying, totally terrifying. For many Asians in alliance relationships, it's pretty frightening. And for Mexico, it drives people completely insane, yes.
I'll just add one other point, is I think there's a structural problem independent of Trump versus Biden or anything like that, and that is the degree of polarization in the country means that you do get these pendulum swings. Right? I was arguing earlier that I don't think they may be as extreme as you might have been told or as you might have read, but you can think of a few concrete cases. So the Obama administration negotiates a nuclear deal with Iran, Donald Trump tears it up. Right? The Obama administration was in favor of climate change agreement. Trump walked away. Biden restored them. And the problem is, of course, other countries are going to be less willing to make long-term deals with the United States, to adjust their behavior in the expectation that the United States will follow a particular course of action if they think American policy is going to veer back and forth every 4 years or so. So independent of what you might think about Trump or what you might think about Biden, the degree that we get these pendulum swings on key policy issues, I think, is a real problem for America's image. We have time for one more question if it's relatively brief, and the answers are also concise.
Sure, I can keep it brief. Rebecca Smith, class of 2014 MPP. One of the existential shifts we haven't talked about on this panel is the twin demographic trends of the aging in high-income countries and the growing youth populations in low-income countries. I believe it's within the next 10 to 20 years that all population growth in the world will be concentrated in Africa and India. So, exactly. So I'm wondering what the challenges you see there, but also maybe the opportunities in terms of, we're intrinsically going to need each other. So the opportunities to shift the balance of power.
This is a great question. Why don't we start down? We'll just take it in order. Graham?
So there's actually a piece in the paper today or yesterday about the fact that because of the declining fertility, we may end up actually being at a plateau and even reduction in the total number of people in the world. I would say that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing per se. I think for the aging populations in countries like the US and most of the developed countries, that'll make them more, require more openness, and will be an advantage for open countries or countries that are prepared to welcome people, and it'll give them an opportunity to thrive. And I would say in that world, that's called Advantage US when we're at our best.
Juliette?
I don't know exactly how to answer that in a security lens, but if I could do it as a faculty lens, and then this is a good alumni moment because I'll hooray the school. I mean, one of the exciting things about being here, and we all do multiple things and government work and whatever, is the kids are all right. I mean, one of the, you get if you were reading about this place, it was very different than the experience of being here in the last year. And I know a lot of you have strong opinions of what happened at Harvard or the Kennedy School, but it was much more vibrant, much more interesting than caricatures of the way the world would look. I think in terms of the diversity of viewpoints, people bringing things to the table. There's hate and bad conduct and whatever, that's going to be true anywhere. But in terms of how do I think about those shifts and the diversity and the geographic diversity that this school represents, it's like super hopeful. Because the experience, as I said, the experience of being here and hearing students talk about really difficult issues that were being caricatured on Twitter and like whatever by people on Twitter and stuff, you just got a sense like, if we can play the long game long enough, maybe we can fix some of these problems. That was a good alumni weekend moment. Thank you all for being here.
We'll give you yet another job.
No, I'm going to do this
All right, and I'll just add one other point. I sometimes worry about the fact that if you think of America's closest allies around the world, they are some countries with some really severe demographic problems.
Yeah.
You look at what's happening in Japan, in South Korea, in many parts of Western Europe. So the allies that we think of as being reflexively close to us are going to suffer really severe demographic problems going forward. And again, if you're thinking in a sort of hard-nosed, zero-sum realist fashion, the only consolation there is that those problems are going to be even more severe in places like China, right? And so from that perspective, it may not be quite that bad. And I completely agree with what Juliette said about the kids being all right. It's actually been quite impressive to see, I think, how students here and elsewhere at Harvard have been responding to world events in a quite far-sighted and sensitive way, notwithstanding the occasional excesses that have occurred. Please join me in thanking Graham and Juliette.
Thank you to our panelists. We'll now move into our lunch break. Boxed lunches are available in the dining cafe. Please take your desired lunch and head to the designated classroom displayed above and listed in the program. During this time, a photographer